It is day 4738 of Boswell being in business. And I recall well day 4737 when I was still connected to what is now Porchlight Book Company. And I do miss them a lot as we work down the hall from each other. And I'm so excited that we're able to continue to do some programs together, virtual and otherwise, to introduce tonight's very esteemed guest. I would like to welcome Sally Haldorson, the managing director of Porchlight Book Company, based like Boswell in Milwaukee, but serving customers worldwide. Welcome, Sally.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Welcome. We thank Boswell Bookshop here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for hosting this interview in partnership with Porchlight Book Company. I'm Sally Haldorson, managing director of Porchlight. And it's very fitting to have this wonderful text published in March, National Women's Month, and to speak to Lillian Faderman, author of the newly published Woman, the American History of an Idea. Lillian is an internationally known scholar of lesbian and LGBTQ history, literature, as well as ethnic history and literature. She is an award-winning gender and sexuality scholar, professor emeritus at California State University, Fresno. She's authored many influential books such as Biography of Harvey Milk, Gay LA, The Gay Revolution, and Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. 3 of her titles have made the New York Times Notable Books of the Year list. And Lillian, we are so pleased to have you here. And we are all so lucky that you're going to start out our hour with you with a short reading from your new book.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Sally and Daniel. And I will read from the introduction of the book, the first 3 pages or so of the book. I grew up in the 1950s, surrounded by images of women that had nothing to do with me or most of the girls who were my classmates at Hollenbeck Junior High School in East Los Angeles. Radio and TV images of middle-class wives and mothers like Harriet Nelson and June Cleaver, always in the bosom of their tidy families, did not apply. Nor did the few commercials that featured a working woman, usually a well-groomed blonde secretary. Nor did the ubiquitous warnings to girls to avoid premarital sex, lest they become damaged goods. The girls I went to school with were mostly from immigrant families. Many of them were pachucas, gang girls, who wore short, tight skirts and see-through nylon blouses and engaged in petty outlawry. That was their answer to the stifling mores their parents had brought with them from Mexico and to the white world that disdained them. They were often in trouble as, quote, juvenile delinquents. I, one of the few white girls at Hollenbeck, was also the daughter of an immigrant, an unwed Jewish woman from Eastern Europe who made a living sewing dresses in a downtown LA garment factory. I too was a juvenile delinquent of sorts because I had already discovered my outlaw sexuality and would soon be going to gay girls' bars, flashing a fake ID that said I was an adult. The dominant images of women that I and my Pachuca classmates could not avoid knowing about through radio, TV, movies, billboards, magazines, sermons, laws, textbooks, and teachers had no resonance for us, yet their effect on us was inescapable. It was not unusual for my Pachuca classmates to fall into the juvenile justice system and be sent to juvie, as they called LA's juvenile hall. If their crimes were bad enough, burglary, serious assault, or prostitution, for example, they were sentenced to the Ventura School for Girls, which, despite having the name that sounded like a posh boarding school, was a reform school for what the staff psychiatrist called prize recalcitrants. But throughout the 1950s, these schools' enlightened methods were intended not only to discourage antisocial behavior, but also to reform the girls by inculcating in them the dominant culture's ideal of womanhood. To that end, they were visited by wholesome-looking Hollywood starlets, the studio's idea of a publicity stunt, perhaps, who modeled twirly feminine frocks. They were given charm classes and classes in office skills. They were taken by volunteers, citizens of Ventura, to church services to hear sermons on good morals. The indoctrination often did not work. Students scaled the wall and escaped the Ventura School for Girls so often that finally a security fence had to be built. However, they could not escape knowing the dominant culture's idea of woman and that they had fallen short of it. As for me, I could easily have been caught in a gay bar raid and ended up at the Ventura School for Girls too. Instead, by a lucky encounter in the nick of time, I ended up in a PhD program at UCLA. That was not where a young woman was supposed to be in 1962, but the long forgotten women's writers of the previous century had made a space in PhD programs for women like me who could not go along with the feminine mystique. I entered the program gladly, yet as aware of myself as a fugitive from the ideal of woman as were my Pachuca classmates. How, when, and why had that ideal of woman been created? Why had its grip been so tenacious as to reach even into our poor and neglected little world? And how did it become possible to contest it and to live a life outside of it? Woman began as a personal quest to answer those questions. As someone who has been writing about history for a half century, I naturally look to the past, the 20th century leading me backward to the 19th, then to the 18th, and finally the 17th, when Europeans first began to populate this country. I wanted to know who had a hand in formulating the dominant idea of woman that I had been so aware of, even as I rebelled against it, who had dared to rebel against it in other centuries. What were the forces that finally brought about seismic changes in the concept of woman? And why have traces of the early concept stubbornly remained even into the present? And I'll stop here.
So many good questions. And I think that I have some questions that I've laid out because we have a lot to cover. We've got 400 pages and many hundreds of years in this book. And so we will follow we're going to follow the timeline of your book a bit through these questions to keep us moving, because we could just get stuck in the 1700s. We could be tackling all of the questions that come up now in more current times. So, but I want to start with, it is such an honor to meet you, to have this opportunity for all of us to learn from you. And what it means to be woman in America is such a current and changeable thing. But with this book, Woman, the American History of an Idea, you show us that it always has been. So we're going to start there. This book follows a fairly strict historical timeline beginning in the 1700s, for those of you who have not yet read it. And then more stylistically, you take each notable time period and open it up so we can look inside, like a pop-up book or episodic television. And as you mentioned in the piece that you read, to see who dared to define what woman is, who dared to rebel against who woman is. And you show that in these little pop-ups through time and opening up this timeline. So how did you decide on this format of the book and to start in the 1700s and follow the timeline forward?
Well, I wanted the book to be chronological, but I also wanted to follow themes. For instance, from the beginning, I look at the idea of woman in the public square and how she was forbidden the public square. Anne Hutchinson was banished in the 17th century because she tried to be in the public square. Mary Dyer was hanged. Of course, we all know the story of the witches in the 1650s and the 1690s. I was particularly interested in the notion that, as one magistrate said, women should not be a rash rambler abroad. Anne Hibbins was a rash rambler abroad. She went around checking on the credentials of some carpenters who had worked for her, and she was hanged as a witch because of it. So I tried to figure out when women could possibly take a position in the public square. Surprisingly, it was not during the revolution. And so I returned to that theme of the public square and how hard women wanted to think nationally, as one of them says during the American Revolution. And they were discouraged from doing that. They were encouraged to boycott tea, to boycott other British products, to go back to spinning and weaving so there wouldn't have to be British imports. But that was very clearly the only role they could take in the public square during the revolution. And so my big question as I was writing these chapters is, when did it begin to change? And I got really excited discovering how it began to change. So men had to build a new country, and there was no place for women in the building of that country except in the propagation of mankind, as a 17th century pundit had said. And so women had to be somehow occupied in thinking they were doing something important for the company, and what could it be? And I found a number of suggestions of what that was. One was a 1795 article that talked about the importance of women's moral influence on men. That is, it was only women because they were somehow morally purer than men. They didn't have the raging appetites that men had. It was women who could make men better. And an 1810 sermon that said the same kind of thing. Women were pure, and it was their job to make men better human beings and therefore better citizens. And so what did that mean finally for women? They decided, well, if we're so pure, we need to speak up. We need a public voice. And so they began to establish things like the first moral reform societies that were led by women. And what that meant essentially was trying to get rid of prostitution. And they learned not only how to organize through these moral reform societies, but they also learned how to petition legislatures all over the country. There were like 500 moral reform societies led by women, and they petitioned legislatures, and they made seduction illegal, punishable by a fine and time in prison. They had these wonderful magazines. They were kind of like, it was sort of like an early Me Too movement, because some of those magazines asked women all over the country, in rural areas, in small towns, to send in the names of seducers, of men who were going around doing terrible things to women. But in any case, women learned how to publish magazines and distribute magazines. The same was true of the early temperance movement. If women were so pure, and if the home was their bailiwick, then they had a right to demand that the home be pure, that men stop drinking, stop using the wages that the family needed by drink. And so they began these temperance organizations all over the country. And I loved some of the stories that I found, like a woman by the name of Hannah Jumper in New England, who managed to organize most of the women in her little town. And they decided on a day when they would march through the town, go to all the saloons, demand that these saloons be closed down, told the patrons of the saloons that they had to get out of there, and they carried axes. Long before Carrie Nation, they carried axes, a very unwomanly thing to do, but a real step into the public square. So to answer your question, my book is organized chronologically, but organized thematically too, along themes such as that one.
On 2 points in there, I think something that makes the book so enjoyable to read as a history is the opportunity to meet each of these women that you've already given us some cameos here in who you've been just describing, but also that with each chosen story, with each woman that you have featured, I don't know the right analogy, but it's progressive, right? It's layering. It's small steps equaling big steps, and sometimes steps back and sometimes steps forward. But at the same time, what allows those steps to happen is this constraint, right? Or this prison that you use at times during the book, this definition of the idea of woman, and what you're talking about in terms of the reformers. It shows how inconstant this definition is, right? Because earlier it was women are temptress, woman is temptress, and then we have woman is reformer. And so each time woman becomes something, the definition gets, manipulated so that they fit even less into whatever the definition is.
Yeah, and I think your point about woman as temptress is a very good one. One of the reasons that the Puritans gave for the severe repression of women in the 17th century is that they were daughters of Eve who ruined the world, and it was Adam's job now to redeem the world, and women had to be silent. They had to be silent in church. They had to be silent vis-a-vis their husband, and it was because of the original sin, not of Adam, but of Eve.
Mm-hmm. Let's stick with the sort of the conceptual and construction of this book a little bit so that I make sure that we cover these. The title of your book is Woman. And as I talk about the book with friends and people at work, it's a challenge because language is a challenge, right? Language is a decision. Even as I'm using the word history, all of my, experience with testing out her story versus history and everything we talked about in the 90s about changing words then and now changing language now. So I'm sure you're very specific about the language you used to define this book. And so I think it's very deliberate that you did not name it women, that you did not alter woman as the chosen noun. And is that because there's no such thing as the plural of woman? There's no such constant definition. Are you challenging that? And can every woman define the term independent of this sort of hegemonic definition?
Yes, but what I wanted to say through the title and the subtitle as well is that woman is a construct. Mm-hmm. Pardon me. It's a construct that was sometimes kept to hold women down. It's a construct that was very often established by man. I still love what Simone de Beauvoir said about one is not born, but one becomes a woman, or what Judith Butler said about how being female and being woman are two very different kinds of being, or what Monique Wittig said about the prison of woman and how women had to kill off woman because woman was a construct that was almost invariably defined certainly in early centuries by men. And it was not one that permitted women freedom of choice and freedom of self-definition. So what I do is I present how this construct got established and how women challenged it and how some women did not challenge it. And what I've discovered is what Buddhists long ago discovered, that is the only constant is change, and that has certainly been true for the concept of woman.
And also true, I think, for the how each person is comfortable with any kind of label, right? It is really up to the individual and how they embrace or reject terminology, labeling, language. And did you feel any sort of push to make this book more of a criticism than a history?
Well, one can't help being critical of so many of the insane ideas through the centuries. And so, of course, I'm often very critical. But my goal was to trace the history, how the idea got established here. I was so interested in discovering what the Europeans found on this continent. The Native Americans, who in many tribes, in many Native American nations, the idea of woman was so different from what the Europeans had known and what they wanted to establish here. I tell a story that I found particularly remarkable. This was in the 1620s. Roger Williams, who was a major figure among the Puritans until he got cast out of Massachusetts Bay Colony and went to Rhode Island, he wrote to the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, about the terrible Pequot Wars, in which the colonists had raided a Pequot village, killed many men, women, and children, and the Pequots gave up, they surrendered, they wanted to form a peace treaty with the colonists. And as so often happened with the Pequots and so many other Native American nations, they sent a woman as peacemaker. And Roger Williams wrote to John Winthrop, we questioned her much as to her truth and sent her home. They weren't going to negotiate with her. And then another woman was sent by the Pequots as to negotiate peace. And he said, we questioned her as well and sent her home. And then 4 women and an old man were sent to try to negotiate the peace. And this time the colonists were willing to talk to the old man, not to the 4 women. So I think the colonists simply could not conceive of a society where women had any kind of power. And of course, in many of the tribes, women were in charge of food production, agriculture, food distribution. They were somewhat matrilineal in many of the tribes. It was the daughters that inherited from the mothers. In many tribes, it was the woman who decided when a marriage was over. She simply put the husband's possessions outside, and that was a sign that she wasn't having it. And as one 17th century traveler said about women in the Algonquins, that she was her own person. She could do whatever she wanted in terms of her body. nobody told her what to do, and certainly no male of the family told her what to do. And this was absolutely bizarre to the colonists, who had such a different idea of who woman was.
It's those stories that just are so absorbing in the book, stories that I have never read, and informs my understanding of what has come before. Obviously, that is meaningful to how much we have progressed, regardless of how much has been rescinded as well, that back and forth that we've been talking about. Let's move a little further into a little more recent past, but not very much. In chapter 5, you title 19th Century Woman Leaves Home. And in chapter 6, it's Woman Goes to College and Enters the Professions. And as with all books, the reader who comes to the book interprets the book in a way that resonates. And for me, I started to read the book almost as though woman was the protagonist of this book, and we are on a hero's journey. And we are, as we watch the progress and the challenges, and of all the stories, the riddles, the rhymes, the troll under the bridge, all of this, as we sort of progress over this timeline. And I'm wondering if you think that's a crazy interpretation, or do you feel like woman is a character who has grown and matured? And if so, where is she at in her evolution now?
I like your interpretation, but it worries me a little bit, because it sounds as though the book agrees with an essentialist notion of
Right.
woman. And of course, my big argument in the book is that there is no essentialist woman, although men have tried to say there was, and women, even in recent times, some women have tried to say there was. And so what I attempt to show is that, as I said, woman was a construct. Women, plural, have often fought against the essentialist notion of a woman. Women of color have shown us that it means something very different to be a woman of color from what it means to be a white woman. The class issue is very important. The transgender issue has become very important and is so much in the news now, and I address that issue. So no, I guess I can't say that it's woman's heroic journey, because what woman?
Right.
I'm reminded too of a poem that I found so interesting at the height of the feminist movement. I first found it in the 1970s, was written by a Black woman who was a member of the Combahee River Collective. Her name was Lorraine Bethel. I think she was a graduate of Yale, but the poem is called "What You Mean We, White Woman," meaning that the story for Black women about a woman, and even the feminist story, is very different. And I want to make that really clear in the book, and that is one of my main goals, to show that not only is there no woman as men defined women, and as some women with complicity defined woman, but woman is just so dependent on race and class and era and geography and so many things that would combat the essentialist notion of woman as all the same,
Right.
which of course was, and that's a point that I make about women in the 17th century. Men were beginning to define themselves as individuals. You were an artisan, or you were a merchant, or whatever, but woman was all the same, except of course for Native American women, and there was a real attempt to make them like white women. In the 18th century, George Washington, as our first president, had a meeting with the Cherokee and told the male leaders that the women have to learn how to spin and weave like white women do. They have to stop doing this agriculture. The men have to start doing agriculture and stop hunting. And stop hunting, of course, because they had to stop taking up the land where the white settlers wanted to settle. And of course, in the times of slavery, enslaved women were not considered woman as woman was defined. Woman was defined by her motherhood. Woman was defined by her sexual modesty. Enslaved women by the slavers weren't permitted those things. So enslaved women were outside of the definition of woman.
I think that section is, you make it very clear how different the allowances or the, that I feel like that word is, that's not the right word, that the definers of what woman is at any given time, but particularly at that time, were again creating a sort of inconstant that suited themselves and suited the limitations that they wanted to place on each woman, because there were exceptions made for in different relationships or scenarios, and you tell stories about that, about marriages that worked differently, about households that worked differently, communities that work differently, and we get a real sense of sort of dismantling my own hero's journey interpretation, that each effort to move forward was either hindered or helped depending on the individual circumstance.
Yes, it was also interesting to me the way in which women sometimes hindered the effort to move forward, how women were sometimes complicit in this battle to escape from woman. And frequently, women who you certainly would not suspect could become complicit. I'm thinking, for instance, of Catherine Beecher. She's the first woman that I write about who was extremely complicit, that I found astonishing because it was do as I say, not as I do. Catherine Beecher wrote. She was educated. She really had a sense of herself. She was a powerful woman. She actually started a school for girls, but she made it clear that although she thought they should study serious subjects like philosophy, she wanted them to study domestic philosophy, or chemistry. She wanted them to study domestic chemistry. And what she meant by that is if you study chemistry, you know why food goes bad, for instance. And so it's a preparation for being a better wife and mother. And the whole idea was, well, it was the concept of Republican motherhood. Women should be educated so they could educate their sons, because of course boys had to be educated because they were going to be men who vote. And I trace a number of women like Catherine Beecher. Sarah Josepha Hale was a fascinating woman. She was the editor of Godey's Ladies book at a time when there was no such thing as a woman editor. So she had this high-powered job, and she used it she was in favor of education, I should say. When Vassar was started, she really promoted that. But other than that, she used her high-powered jobs to tell women that they had to be good wives, that even if they didn't have a good husband, that was the husband that God gave them, and they had to give him the respect that was due to a husband. When suffrage became an issue, she was vehemently, in the pages of Godey's Ladies book, vehemently anti-suffrage. And I trace this even into later eras. I'm really fascinated by Phyllis Schlafly, for instance. In the 1970s, Phyllis Schlafly ran for Congress twice. Phyllis Schlafly wrote a best-selling book about, she was always very conservative. It was about, and in fact, it really put Barry Goldwater forward in 1964, A Choice Not an Echo, and he became the presidential nominee. Phyllis Schlafly was very interested in organizing on a large scale, and yet she told women that a woman has a right to be a woman. We don't want equal rights. We want our special privileges. Right. What was she doing then? But and she's only one of just this long line of women who achieved huge success and spent their careers telling women that they should not want huge success. They should want to be wives and mothers.
How difficult is it to tell the stories of these women, I suppose, knowing that they moved the needle forward, perhaps in some scenarios, as you mentioned a few, and I had a couple in my notes here. M. Carey Thomas, who did all that she could to advance women's opportunities at Bryn Mawr, but you wrote, shared some of her day's horrific blind spots in terms of her racism and classism. And, you know, even the women who had opportunities during the wars where they were able to activate themselves in the name of patriotism. We see this with suffrage as well. Like, there were many people left behind in the pursuit of suffrage and the accomplishments in it. And so how difficult, I mean, this is, maybe that's not a good way of putting it, but how challenging is it to address this intersectionality when we're talking about a history that is so limiting?
Yes, very challenging, particularly in our day with our present sensitivities. Mm-hmm. When I first discovered M. Carey Thomas, it was when I was working on my book, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers. So the book came out in 91. So I first discovered her in the 1980s, and she was absolutely my hero. This was a woman who in the 1870s wanted a PhD, and there was no place she could get one in the United States. And so she and the woman who was her partner went off together to Europe. She finally ended up in 1882 getting a PhD with honors from the University of Zurich. She had such a sense of self-confidence, and in the 1880s, here she was in her early 20s, and she had heard that a new college was starting for women, Bryn Mawr, and she put herself forward as she wanted to be the president of the college. She didn't get that job, but she got the job as the dean of the college. And because James Rhodes, who was the president, was often ill, she took the role of president. And then she did become the president. And a lot of the colleges were offering home economics courses for women. She said, we're not having that. We're not having any home economics courses at Bryn Mawr. She offered a PhD to students at Bryn Mawr. It wasn't just a liberal arts college. You could get a PhD from Bryn Mawr. She encouraged young women to go into professions. 90% of Bryn Mawr graduates worked in some sort of professional capacity. How could you not admire a woman like that? And then after I published Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, I wrote about her again in my book, To Believe in Women. And by then I was beginning to discover things about her that I found really upsetting. She was anti-Semitic. She said specifically that she wouldn't hire Jewish professors because it was much better to have people like us, meaning most of her students who were WASP. She said that she wouldn't permit Black students to go to Bryn Mawr because there were too many students from the South and the Midwest who would be uncomfortable with Black students. Horrifying things, and there's no getting around how horrifying those things were. And so I have personally been very perplexed about how to deal with M. Carey Thomas, and I decided that the best way to deal with it was simply lay it all out, the wonderful things that she did and the awful things that she did. And she was also a little bit inexplicable. For instance, she, as I said, she was anti-Semitic, but in the 1920s, just before she retired, she encouraged a summer school at Bryn Mawr for women laborers, and particularly women who were seamstresses, who were in the garment industry, as my mother was. My mother didn't go to that school, but something like 30% of the students were Jewish in that school, and surely she knew that. So, how do you reconcile her disgusting anti-Semitism with that? I don't know how to reconcile it except to observe it and point out that of course it's horrifying, but nevertheless, she really advanced the needle as far as the position of woman was concerned.
I want to make sure that we get this in to branch off of. I think we'll get back to that same topic, but your work in your writing, your advocacy, your life has been focused on LGBTQ history and the community. And throughout this book, you bring in stories of lesbian and transgender women throughout the history of woman. How does sharing these stories work to expand the contemporary boundaries that are being dismantled right now in how we understand what it is to be woman?
Yeah, I think the trans issue has really also moved the needle forward in the most interesting ways, particularly with Gen Z. In a recent poll that I saw, Gen Z, the pollsters were interested in people from Gen Z, that is young people today, who were in their teens and their early 20s. 35% of them said that they, either themselves or among their friends and acquaintances, prefer to be called they rather than he or she. So I think the whole discussion of non-binary identities is really raising such interesting questions about the concept of woman. I did a very interesting interview with a trans woman who was a psychiatrist, and she wanted to do the interview under a pseudonym because she said she didn't want, and she's stealth, I should say. She passes, nobody knows that she's a trans woman. She's simply a woman. But her point, so I did the interview under a pseudonym, but her point was that just as Kinsey had a Kinsey scale that went from 0 to 6, describing sexuality, 0 meaning totally heterosexual, 6 meaning totally homosexual. There needs to be a scale in terms of gender that goes from 0 to 6, 0 meaning totally masculine, 6 meaning totally feminine. The psychiatrist that I'm talking about said that she was a 6. She felt herself to be totally feminine and felt that, and it was so interesting to me that she used these sort of old-fashioned definitions of feminine. So I asked what that meant to her, and she said, well, from my childhood, I was always more caring and more gentle, and that was femininity to her. But I think her point was, and it's my point as well, that there are a lot of people who are 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s in terms of gender. And I think we're beginning to understand that much more than we did even in the 20th century, that very few people are totally male or masculine or totally feminine. And indeed, if I may continue this for another minute, there was a very interesting Pew Research poll in 2019 that asked, are you, do you consider yourself totally masculine for men? And do you consider yourself totally feminine for women? 1/4 of the men, this was in 2019, said they were totally masculine. 3/4 of the men said they were not.
Right.
And 1/5 of the women said they were totally feminine. And the rest of the women said they were not totally feminine. So I think more and more we're recognizing that gender is so much more complicated than was granted in the 17th or 18th or 19th or 20th century, and even early in our century. And I tell some interesting stories in the book about that as well.
There's so much to read in here, and there are, as you just said, there's so many interesting stories. We do have to wrap up. We've already used our time talking about only a small amount of engaging and intriguing and troubling things in this book. So the last thing I think I would ask you, if we can just take a couple more minutes of our folks' time, is whether you feel like you answered through your book any of those questions you asked originally, in terms of whether we are still imprisoned by this definition of woman, or if those boundaries have disintegrated.
Yes, I deal with that in the epilogue to my book. And in fact, the epilogue is called "The End of Woman?" ? I don't know. As I said earlier, the only constant is change, and it's very difficult to predict the future. It's hard to think we will ever go back, but I even present a possible dystopian scenario that might send us back in the epilogue. So I don't know.
But it is a fascinating exploration and a fascinating journey, and to what has brought us to now. And we are so thankful for your time and your great intellect, and you have us thinking. And this is a tribute to all of the people and all of those people who define themselves as women who have come before us.
Thank you, Sally. I enjoyed it. And thank you, Daniel.
An honor. Thank you, Sally, so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming. We wouldn't have either bookstore without you. So
yeah,
hope to see another event.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.